I didn't plan to talk about this. Not today, not ever, really. But I'm 71 years old, and I've learned that silence doesn't protect the people you love. It just lets the wrong ones keep winning. So I'm going to tell you what happened. All of it. My son is 23 years old now. He goes by his middle name Ezra, which I gave him because I always loved the sound of it. Steady and quiet, like him. He was diagnosed with ADHD and a processing disorder when he was 6. The school called me in, sat me down across a long table with 4 adults I'd never met, and explained that my grandson was struggling to integrate in a traditional learning environment. That was the phrase they used, struggling to integrate, like he was a foreign object the classroom was trying to reject. His mother, my daughter Vivian, was not at that meeting. She had a work thing. That's what she told me. A work thing. I didn't say anything about it at the time. Vivienne was 26, freshly divorced, trying to hold down a job in pharmaceutical sales. And I told myself she was overwhelmed. I made excuses for her the way mothers do, the way we keep doing long past the point when we should stop. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. Vivienne didn't want to hear what the school was going to say. She already knew something was different about Ezra. She'd known since he was 3. And she had decided, somewhere deep in a place she never let me see, that different meant broken, and she didn't want a broken child. She left him with me that fall. Dropped him off on a Friday with a duffel bag and a box of his favourite cereal, the kind with the little marshmallows, and said she needed a few weeks to get back on her feet. Get a new apartment. A fresh start. She kissed him on the forehead while he was watching cartoons, and didn't look back when she walked out the door. He was 7 years old. Those few weeks became a few months. The calls got shorter, then rarer, then stopped. By Christmas, Vivienne had moved to Phoenix with someone she'd met online. I know because her cousin told me. My own daughter did not. I remember sitting in the kitchen after I put Ezra to bed that Christmas Eve. I had wrapped his presents with the little reindeer paper he'd picked out himself. I had hot chocolate on the stove, and I sat at that table, and I cried quietly so he wouldn't hear me, because I didn't know what to tell a 7-year-old boy about why his mother wasn't there. I didn't come up with a good answer that night. I'm not sure I ever did, but I made a decision. I was not going to let that question be the story of his life. I filed for legal guardianship in the spring. The paperwork alone took 4 months. I was 61 years old, retired from 28 years as a middle school reading specialist, living on a pension and Social Security. And suddenly, I was the legal guardian of a child with special needs. My friends didn't know what to say. My pastor said I was brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I didn't have a choice, because there wasn't one. He was my grandson. He was 7. What was I supposed to do? The first years were hard in ways I couldn't have predicted. Ezra didn't have meltdowns the way people assume kids with processing disorders do. Not often, anyway. What he had was stillness, this deep, unreachable quiet that would come over him, like he'd gone somewhere inside himself and locked the door. Teachers misread it as defiance. One of them wrote in a progress report that he was deliberately unresponsive. He was 8 years old. I fought that. I fought all of it. I sat through every IEP meeting. That's an individualized education program for anyone who doesn't know, with a notepad and a list of questions, and I did not leave until I had answers. I found him a tutor who specialized in kids with his profile, a young man named Mr. Abernethy who came twice a week and sat on the floor with Ezra and never once raised his voice. I switched schools twice. I drove 40 minutes each way to a charter school in the next county, because they had a learning lab and a full-time aide. I did whatever it took. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that Ezra's brain wasn't just struggling. It was also doing something extraordinary on its own. He was 9 when I first noticed it with numbers. He was sitting at the kitchen table, supposedly doing his math homework, but instead he had covered 3 pages with these spiraling calculations I couldn't read. I almost threw them away, thinking he was doodling. I showed them to his tutor. Mr. Carper. Abernethy was quiet for a long time, and then he said very carefully, "Mrs. Beauchamp, I think you need to have someone take a look at this." We had him tested. A full neuropsychological evaluation, 2 days at a clinic in Charlotte, which cost more than I want to say, and which I put on a credit card I spent the next 2 years paying off. The report that came back was 12 pages long. I read it 4 times. The summary in plain language was this: Ezra had significant processing challenges in sequential verbal tasks, and he had an exceptional, near-prodigious aptitude for pattern recognition, spatial reasoning, and mathematical logic. The doctor used the word prodigious. I had to look it up when I got home, because I wanted to be sure I understood it correctly. I did. He was 10. I don't want to make this sound like one of those movies where everything becomes wonderful the moment someone recognizes the child's gift. It wasn't like that. The gift and the struggle lived right next to each other, all the time. He still had days when the world felt too loud, too fast, too much. He still cried sometimes over things that seemed small to everyone else and enormous to him. He still needed more time, more patience, more of everything than most kids his age. But he also started building things. First it was models. Those intricate architectural kits that take adults weeks to finish. He did them in days without instructions, working from the picture on the box. Then he started modifying them, changing the structures, improving the load distribution. His tutor introduced him to basic coding when he was 11. By 12, he was taking free online courses through MIT OpenCourseWare. By 13, he had built 3 small applications on his own. A scheduling tool for people with memory difficulties, a color-coded daily planner designed for kids with ADHD, and something he called a translation layer for processing written instructions into visual formats. I didn't fully understand what he was making. I still don't, not technically, but I understood that it was real, that it worked, and that he was making it alone, in his room, at night, because it was the thing that made the world make sense to him. I kept Vivienne's number in my phone all those years. I called her twice, once when Ezra started middle school, once when he had a health scare at 13 that turned out to be nothing but terrified me in the moment. Both times she picked up, both times she asked if he was okay, said she was glad, said she'd been meaning to reach out. She never did. The number sat in my contacts like a bruise I kept forgetting about until I pressed it. Ezra turned 16 in April. By August, he had been accepted into an early college program at a state university in our area. Not because of grades, which were complicated and inconsistent, but because a professor in the computer science department had seen some of his work and reached out directly. He started classes that fall. He was the youngest person in every room he walked into, and he was always the quietest, and he was almost always the most prepared. The application came 2 years later. It started as a tool he built for himself, a system for organizing the kind of nonlinear thinking that his brain did naturally, and making it legible to people whose brains work differently. He refined it for a year. He tested it quietly with a handful of other students with similar profiles. He filed the paperwork himself, researched the process, chose an attorney from a legal aid clinic who helped him at reduced cost. The licensing deal came first, then a partnership with a company that developed assistive technology for students with learning differences. then a larger acquisition offer that he sat on for 6 months, talking to advisors, running the numbers himself before he accepted. The final figure was $2.7 million. He called me from the university's business law center on a Tuesday afternoon. I was making dinner. Pork chops and green beans, the same thing I've made on Tuesdays since before he was born. He said, "Grandma, it went through." His voice was the same as always, even, quiet, like he was telling me the mail had come. I had to sit down. I didn't tell anyone for 2 weeks, not my sister, not my pastor, not my neighbor across the street who'd watched Ezra grow up and always asked about him. Ezra asked me not to, and I respected that. He was not a person who needed the world's applause. He never had been. But someone found out, I don't know exactly how. A press release, maybe. A mention in a trade publication. A mutual contact who connected the dots. What I know is that on a Thursday morning in February, my phone rang, and it was a number I recognized but hadn't heard in almost 8 years. It was Vivienne. She was calling from Phoenix, and her voice had the careful, warm quality of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say. She asked how I was. She asked about Ezra. She said she thought about him all the time. She said she'd been going through some things, not specific things, just things, and that she knew she had made mistakes. She said the word mistakes the way people say it when they mean something much smaller than what they actually did. I listened. I didn't say much. At the end, she said, "I'd really love to reconnect with him, Mama. I think it could be really healing for all of us." I said I would pass along the message. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time looking out the window at the yard. She arrived 6 weeks later, not to visit, as it turned out, to meet with an attorney. I found out through Ezra, who was calmer about it than I was. His attorney had contacted him. Vivienne was claiming that as his biological parent, she had right to a portion of the assets he had developed during his minority, the years he was under 18. Her attorney had sent a letter citing statutes I'd never heard of, framing the argument around parental interest in a minor child's earnings. He had been 16 when he started building the application. He had been 17 when he filed the initial paperwork. He had not been a minor for 2 years by the time the deal closed. I didn't know any of that mattered legally, but Ezra did. When his attorney called to walk him through the letter, I was in the room. I was trying not to show how frightened I was. Ezra sat at the kitchen table, the same table he'd done his homework at for 15 years, with his hands folded in front of him, listening. When the attorney finished, he asked 2 or 3 very specific questions. Then he said he'd like a few days to gather some documentation. I asked him that night what he was thinking. He looked at me the way he sometimes does, that steady, direct look that still surprises me after all these years, and he said, "She's going to make arguments that aren't supported by the actual record, so I want to make sure the record is complete." His attorney described it to me later as the most organized evidence package he had received from any client in 20 years of practice. Ezra had kept records of everything, not because he anticipated this moment, he hadn't, but because organization was how his brain worked. He had documentation of the development timeline, his enrollment dates, the legal filings, the correspondence with the university, the licensing agreements, all of it time-stamped, all of it cross-referenced. There was also a folder, and this is the part that undid me when I found out, that contained every report card, every IEP document, every medical record, every school communication from the time he came to live with me until he turned 18. He hadn't asked me for them. He had made copies over the years, quietly, because he said the story of how something was made matters as much as what it became. He said that to me when he was 19. I wrote it down. The mediation session was held on a Monday in a law office in downtown Charlotte. I was there. Vivienne was there across the table with her attorney, a man in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension check. She looked older than I remembered, and there was something careful and brittle about the way she was sitting, like she was holding herself together by concentration. Her attorney made his arguments. They were, as Ezra had predicted, not well supported by the actual record. The application had been filed after Ezra turned 18. The development work could not be cleanly attributed to any period of minority without ignoring the documented timeline entirely, and the question of parental interest in a minor's earnings is complicated, significantly complicated, by a decade-plus gap in any parental involvement. Ezra sat through it all without fidgeting, without interrupting. At one point, Vivienne's attorney suggested that the emotional difficulty of his childhood might actually have been a contributing factor to his development. An argument so contorted I saw his own attorney blink, and Ezra just waited until the man finished, and then quietly asked for which specific statutory provision that argument was relevant. The attorney didn't have a clean answer. At the end of his attorney's presentation, Vivienne looked across the table at Ezra. Just looked at him. And he met her eyes, and he didn't look away, and he didn't look angry, and he didn't look sad. He looked like someone who had already decided how he felt about the situation and didn't need anyone else's input on it. She said quietly, "Ezra, I am sorry." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, just as quietly, "I know." That was all. The mediation concluded without an agreement. Vivienne's attorney filed a formal complaint 2 weeks later. The judge dismissed it in 45 days. I am not going to tell you that Vivienne and Ezra have a relationship now. They don't, not really. He sent her a few short messages since then. Not warm, not cold, just factual. He said once that he doesn't have hatred in him for her. That hatred takes up too much space, but forgiveness for him doesn't mean closeness. It means putting something down and walking away from it. He's 23 now. He lives about 20 minutes from me. He comes for dinner on Tuesdays, pork chops and green beans still, and we sit at the kitchen table where he used to do his homework, and he tells me about what he's working on, which I mostly don't understand, and I tell him about my week, which he listens to with the same focus he gives everything. His new project is a non-profit. He's developing tools for grandparents and non-parental caregivers who are raising kids with learning differences, resources, community support, grant navigation. The kind of practical information nobody handed me when I was 61 years old, with a second grader and a stack of IEP paperwork I didn't know how to read. He asked me to be on the advisory board. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want to say something to anyone watching this who is where I was 15 years ago, who is raising a grandchild, a niece or nephew, a child that someone else stepped back from. I want to say the hard part is real. I am not going to tell you it isn't. There will be meetings that break your heart and forms you don't understand, and nights when you sit at the kitchen table after everyone is in bed and you don't know how you're going to keep going. But I also want to say, stay, show up to the meetings, drive the 40 minutes, sit on the floor with them, keep the records, write down the things they say that matter, because they will matter later, even when it isn't clear how. The world will not always see what your child is. There will be tables full of adults who use words like struggling to integrate and deliberately unresponsive. There will be people who see difference and decide it means limitation. Don't you believe it? Don't you let them make you believe it. Ezra knew, even when he was 7 years old and couldn't name it, that there was someone in his life who was not going to leave. He told me that once, when he was about 17, he said, "Grandma, I always knew you were going to be there in the morning. That's all I did. I was there in the morning. It turned out that was enough. I keep coming back to one moment. Not the mediation, not the judge's dismissal, not even the phone call when Ezra told me the deal had closed. I keep coming back to a Tuesday evening when he was 9 years old, sitting at my kitchen table with 3 pages covered in numbers I couldn't read. I almost threw those pages away. I almost decided they were nothing. That's the thing about consequences. They don't always announce themselves. The ones that matter most often look, at first, like ordinary moments you could easily walk past. I almost walked past that one. I'm grateful every day that I didn't. What I've come to understand after everything is that our lives tend to move in the direction of what we repeatedly choose, not dramatically, not all at once, just steadily the way water moves downhill, following the path of whatever decisions we keep making, day after day, when nobody is watching and there's no reward for getting it right. Vivienne made her choices for years. Small ones, mostly. The meeting she didn't attend, the call she didn't return, the duffel bag she packed and the door she didn't look back at. None of those felt like final decisions, I'm sure. They never do when you're making them. But they added up into something that couldn't be undone by a phone call or a lawyer's letter 15 years later. That's not cruelty, that's just how it works. What we abandon doesn't wait for us, and Ezra made his choices too. Every night he stayed at that table working on something no one asked him to build. Every hour he spent learning things that were hard for him, in a brain that processed the world differently than most, without anyone promising him it would pay off. He didn't build what he built because he was chasing a number. He built it because it was the thing that made sense to him, because his mind needed a problem worth solving and he gave it one. That kind of integrity, doing the real work even when the outcome isn't guaranteed, that's not talent. Talent is just the raw material. What Ezra had was something harder to come by, the willingness to keep going when the path isn't clear and no one is cheering. I think about the word prodigious, the one the doctor used in that evaluation report. I looked it up when I got home, sitting at that same kitchen table, because I wanted to understand exactly what it meant. What I didn't understand then, what took me years to see, is that intelligence without character is just potential that hasn't been tested yet. Ezra's mind was extraordinary, but what protected him, what carried him through every hard year between 7 and 23, wasn't his aptitude for pattern recognition. It was who he was. It was the steadiness, the honesty, the quiet refusal to become bitter about things that would have broken someone else. He kept records not because he suspected his mother would come back. He kept them because accuracy mattered to him. Because he believed the story of how something was made is part of what it means. That's a moral position, whether he called it that or not. I did one thing right in all of this, maybe only one. I stayed. I showed up to the meetings and drove the long roads and sat on the floor and kept the paperwork and made pork chops on Tuesdays. I didn't do it because I was brave. I did it because he was there and he needed someone to be there too. He told me once that he always knew I'd be there in the morning. That's the whole story, really. That's all of it.